causes of war can often be traced back historically to some past perceived injustice or humiliation, a wrong that needs righting. After the Great War of 1914-18, the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 was set up to punish the aggressors and reorganise the New World, but simply ended up causing resentment. Of the vanquished Central Powers, Germany bore the full brunt of the Allies, particularly French, desire for revenge and reparations. In the treaty, Germany lost 13% of its land, including the productive Saarland, all its overseas colonies, and was made to pay compensation of $440 billion in today's prices. For a country on the edge of economic collapse, this was just too much. The Weimar Republic, established in 1919, struggled for years with economic hardship, political unrest, and eventually hyperinflation. This situation was temporarily shored up by Germany mortgaging off its railways, national bank, and industries in return for US loans through the Dawes Plan of 1924. But the old world, struggling with the new economic reality after the Great War, was slipping steadily into depression. In 1929, the Wall Street crash triggered worldwide economic collapse, including the US banks who'd been keeping Weimar Germany afloat. Suddenly there was no more money. By 1932, German industrial production had fallen by 41%, and unemployment increased by 230%. In July, Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party became the largest party in the Berlin Reichstag, with 37% of the vote. In January 1933, he was appointed Chancellor of Germany and the Third Reich. All political opposition henceforward was crushed. Heavy German spending on rearmament, infrastructure and military recruitment restored prosperity and reduced unemployment. What misgivings the German people had about the Nazis politically were ignored with the rise of popular nationalism, full-time work and strong leadership. Hitler set about re-establishing Germany's international authority by taking back the industrial Saarland in 1935, supporting Franco's nationalists in Spain and sending troops into the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, and annexing her Great War ally Austria and the German minority part of Czechoslovakia in 1938. He also started a campaign to eliminate Jews and other ethnic minorities from German territory. Alarmed, the French and British attempted appeasement, and in the 1938 Munich Agreement accepted some of Hitler's demands in Czechoslovakia with the hope of limiting further German expansion. But there was still the issue of the German minority areas in Poland. In March 1939, the British Prime Minister Chamberlain warned Hitler that any move on Poland would result in war. The next month, the German Wehrmacht began to make invasion plans. In August 1939, Hitler agreed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Soviet leader Stalin in Moscow to protect Germany from any interference from the East and to share Poland and the Baltic states between them. The stage for war was now set. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops attacked Poland, and on the 3rd of September, France and Britain declared war on Germany. So, why was Hitler clearly in a rush to go to war in 1939? Well, really, it could not have been any other year. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy and Japan, were more or less fully armed, in Germany's case, ready for total war. Of the Allies, Britain and France were reluctantly rearming themselves, but still hoping to avoid war. In the Soviet Union, Stalin was battling to impose his will and control dissidents through the Great Purge, as well as trying to rearm. The other ally, the USA, was still struggling out of a 10-year economic depression, which had seen unemployment rise by 600% and industrial production fall by over 40%, and through its neutrality acts had no desire to get involved in European affairs. Hitler was confident the Allies were too weak to interfere, and reasoned that a blitzkrieg conquest of continental Europe would then enable Germany to concentrate on the real enemy, the Soviet Union. The principle of blitzkrieg was simple: hit an enemy with overwhelming military force and before they could recover, set up secure lines of supply and a dominant military occupation. By the end of June 1940 in Western Europe, this had been accomplished, with British forces sent to help France hurriedly evacuated at Dunkirk. Britain now stood alone, suffering non-stop bombing of military and civilian targets in what became known as the Battle of Britain. But Hitler made three assumptions, all of which proved to be disastrously wrong. One was that Britain, isolated and bombed by the Luftwaffe, could not provide any threat, even if the USA could be persuaded to supply aid through the German Navy's U-boat cordon. Two, if the USA did join in hostilities, Japan would provide enough of a match to keep the USA occupied and out of European affairs until Germany was in an impregnable position. Three, that Soviet resources would be insufficient to mount a counterattack once the Red Army had been beaten and the Russian cities of Moscow, Leningrad and Stalingrad had fallen into German hands. So, cancelling the proposed invasion of Britain, Hitler set out his plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And on the 22nd of June 1941, almost 4 million Axis troops entered the USSR in the biggest invasion in history. After Dunkirk, Britain was left with only defence and retrenchment. The rapid growth of the RAF in the 1930s and the deployment of radar meant that Britain's skies were eventually secure, but shipping was still prey to relentless U-boat attack. The partial cracking by Polish mathematicians of German Enigma military code machines and the setting up of Ultra at Bletchley Park to develop this further, using the first electronic programmable computers called Colossus, meant that the British were able to track German High Command operational activities. Eventually, nearly all German Army and Navy messages were decoded within hours of transmission. This advantage meant it was possible to begin considering an Allied invasion, but only if a reluctant USA could be persuaded to join in. That reluctance changed suddenly on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, with a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Imperial Japan had sought power and natural resources through conquest in the Pacific. With plans to roll back Western forces in their Southeast Asian colonies, Japan feared the USA would enter the war to defend its old allies and decided on a preemptive bombing strike on the US Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, with huge damage and loss of life. On the next day, the 8th of December, US President Roosevelt declared war on Japan and on Germany and Italy 3 days later. The Red Army, caught out by the German 1941 June offensive, finally stopped the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht on the outskirts of Moscow. The casualties were enormous: 1 million Soviet troops and nearly 500,000 Wehrmacht troops by January 1942. The Russian winter and Soviet resistance had blunted the effects of blitzkrieg, and for the first time in the war, Germany had lost the initiative. But despite this setback, German morale in early 1942 was high. They held most of Europe to a line from Leningrad to Rostov on the Black Sea. Britain was isolated. The U-boat offensive in the Atlantic was successful, and Lieutenant General Rommel had captured Tobruk in North Africa. In summer 1942, the German army moved southwards towards the Caucasus oil fields and the city of Stalingrad, and to one of the most savage battles ever fought. Over 2 million combatants, men and women, died in fighting which often went from street to street. Soviet forces in Operations Mars and Uranus, combined with appalling winter weather, eventually destroyed the German Sixth Army, which ran out of munitions and supplies. Cold, disease and starvation did the rest. In Africa, victory at El Alamein in October 1942 saw the Allies start to push the Axis troops out of North Africa, from where Allied invasions of Sicily in July 1943 and Italy in September 1943 followed. At the same time, successful decoding of German naval messages and improved surveillance meant that the Allies were overcoming the U-boat threat in the Atlantic. British and American aircraft were overpowering the overstretched German Luftwaffe, and many major German cities were now suffering nighttime bombing. The destruction of the steel-making Rhine-Ruhr region in spring 1943 seriously disrupted steel, weapons and aircraft production. Plans for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, were well underway by August 1943, and June 1944 was chosen, with US General Dwight Eisenhower in overall command. Subterfuge was used to direct the German High Command away from what was really happening, and solid air and sea cover protected the Allies' build-up from German surveillance. The early victories in the Pacific against unprepared opponents left the Japanese overconfident and overextended. US and British cryptanalysts had already broken Japanese codes, including the Imperial Navy's most secure code JN-25 and the Merchant Marine Code JN-40. This led to the US ambush of the Japanese fleet at Midway in June 1942, destroying most of the fleet's aircraft carriers, and Allied submarines causing devastation to the Japanese merchant fleet, trying to supply their troops and homeland. Oil supplies, weapons production and skilled manpower could no longer keep up with the attrition of war. Battles at Guadalcanal, Saipan and Operation Cartwheel, led by General MacArthur, went on to destroy or cut off Japanese positions. Naval battles off the Philippines effectively crippled the Imperial Japanese Navy, which no longer could supply or reinforce their land troops around the Pacific. These defeats led to the resignation of Japanese Prime Minister Tojo and provided the United States with air bases to launch intensive heavy bombing attacks on the Japanese home islands. In Eastern Europe, the battle for Kursk in July and August 1943 finally exhausted the German Wehrmacht. In 2 months, 7,000 tanks and 3,000 planes were damaged or destroyed on both sides in the biggest armoured and aerial battles ever seen. Total casualties were well over 1 million combatants. Extended supply lines, damaged by Allied bombing to factories and railways in Germany, Allied decryption of German tactical messages, much improved Red Army fighting techniques and the apparent limitless supply of Soviet troops and weapons meant the end of German expansion. By June 1944, the stage was set for 2 huge invasions. The Allied Normandy landings, where 3 million troops were landed by the end of August, and in the east, where the German Army Group Centre faced 1.7 million Soviet troops, but with only half as many men and only 15% of the number of Soviet tanks and aircraft. By autumn, both Allied armies were only 1,000 kilometres from Berlin, and by February 1945 both armies were within Germany's borders, and the defeat of Germany was now inevitable. In the same month, US President Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Churchill and Soviet leader Stalin met for a conference at Yalta on the Black Sea, where they agreed on the conditions for the occupation of post-war Germany. But shortly after his return home on the 12th of April, President Roosevelt died suddenly of a stroke and was succeeded by Harry Truman. 3 days later, British troops entered the Nazi concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. The Allies swept on across western Germany while Soviet forces stormed Berlin in late April. On the 30th of April 1945, the Reichstag was captured, signalling the end of the Third Reich. Hitler committed suicide on the same day and was succeeded by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who issued the instructions for German forces to surrender on the 8th of May, now known as VE or Victory in Europe Day. In the Philippines, Burma, Borneo and China, cut-off Japanese troops lacking supplies and men were pushed back by Allied advances. US troops invaded the southern Japanese islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The aim was to use Okinawa as the main airbase for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. But on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, President Truman ordered US planes to drop 2 atomic bombs, called Little Boy and Fat Man, and developed by the Manhattan Project, on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an estimated 200,000 people. Japan surrendered on August the 15th, 1945, and World War II finally ended. Out of nearly 60 million deaths in the war, 40 million were civilians, killed by disease, starvation, bombing, massacres and genocide. Nazi Germany was responsible for up to 12 million planned deaths of those considered unworthy of life in concentration camps built in the areas they had controlled. 6 million Jews in what became known as the Holocaust, as well as 5 million Slav prisoners of war, Roma and disabled people perished. Another 12 million East Europeans were used as slave labour in the German economy. In the Soviet Union, where the war death toll claimed 27 million lives, and where 1 in 4 citizens were killed or wounded, many Soviet soldiers who had surrendered to the Germans were sent to the Gulag as prisoners suspected of anti-Soviet sympathies. In the East, Japanese slave labour camps of prisoners of war, where death rates of 30 to 40% were common, were closed down and the prisoners returned home. The Japanese had slaughtered an estimated 7 million Chinese in their occupation of China alone, and enslaved another 10 million workers. Japan was occupied by 300,000 troops led by the United States and the Commonwealth Occupation Force. In April 1952, Japan became an independent country again with a democratic constitution, which included a clause banning rearmament. Germany lost the lands it had annexed in the 1930s, with the German populations being expelled from those areas. The country was divided into 2 basic regions: Soviet-controlled East Germany and West Germany, which fell under the US, British and French zones of occupation. In 1949, West Germany became a federal republic with 10 states. Berlin was divided between the East and the West, and this separation was to last until German reunification in 1990. In German industry and society, a process of denazification was carried out by the Allies to root out Nazi sympathisers. War criminals were tried at military tribunals held in Nuremberg in Bavaria, with executions following those sentenced to death. The Soviet Union held on to all the countries where it had driven out the Axis armies, and they became Soviet Socialist republics, acting as buffers against any future attack from the West. In turn, in 1949, the countries of Western Europe formed the NATO alliance as protection from the East. An Iron Curtain was now said to divide Europe. The hostility between the East and West grew with the development of nuclear weapons in the following years, and this era became generally known as the Cold War. Despite this, or maybe even because of it, peace held. In 1948, fearing a communist takeover of a broken Europe, the US agreed it was in its own rational self-interest to set up the Marshall Plan, involving $12 billion of aid over 4 years to help Europe recover economically. By 1952, European industrial production had increased 35%, agricultural production was above pre-war levels, and the plan led to ideas of European integration to increase prosperity and to ensure the countries of Europe never went to war with one another again. So far, for over 60 years, that plan has been successful.